At my sister's wedding, I stood in the grand ballroom surrounded by glittering chandeliers, cascading white roses, and a sea of people dressed in silk and satin. Everyone was smiling, clapping, taking pictures, and raising their glasses as if the world had stopped to celebrate Sophia, the golden child, the daughter who had always been showered with everything. She looked like a princess on the stage, her white gown flowing like clouds around her feet, her hand looped through her new husband's arm, her face glowing with triumph. It should have been her perfect moment, untouched by shadows. But I knew better. Beneath all the music, the laughter, the carefully orchestrated beauty of this event, there was a storm brewing. And that storm was my parents. I should have been happy for her. I should have clapped and cheered without hesitation. But as I stood there in my emerald dress, holding a glass of champagne that I hadn't touched, all I could feel was the weight of what was about to happen. My parents had already cornered me twice this evening, hinting, nudging, their words dripping with expectation. I knew they were waiting for the right moment to demand what they believed was theirs to claim. Not money, not jewels, but my penthouse, the one symbol of everything I had built with my own blood and sweat, the life I had carved out for myself without a single ounce of their support. I caught my mother's eyes across the room. She was dazzling in her sequined gown, her pearls glinting under the chandeliers, her smile practiced and flawless. But I knew that look. I had seen it countless times, the look that meant she was about to strike, though she would disguise it as love, as family duty, as something that sounded almost reasonable. She started moving toward me, weaving gracefully through the crowd like a queen gliding to claim her throne. My father was only a few steps behind, his expression harder, colder, a man carrying a command rather than a request. Her hand landed on my arm. To anyone watching, it looked like affection, like a mother guiding her daughter to a quiet corner to share a warm word. But her grip was steel, pressing into my skin like a warning. "Madison," she said softly, her voice dipped in honey but laced with iron. "Come with us for a moment." I wanted to pull back to say no, but the eyes were too many, the cameras too close. So I let her lead me, past the tables covered in fine china and flickering candles, past relatives who pretended not to notice the tension, until we reached a shadowed corner behind one of the towering marble pillars. My father was already there, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. "You know why we brought you here?" he began, no hesitation, no mask. His voice was flat, heavy, final. That I crossed my arms, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "I can guess." "The penthouse," my mother said, her eyes lighting up as if she were announcing a gift instead of a demand. "Sophia's starting her new life. She deserves the best. It would mean so much if you gave it to her as a wedding gift." I laughed quietly, bitterly. The sound surprised even me. "You mean the best that I earned? That I worked sleepless nights for? That none of you had a hand in?" My father's face hardened. "Don't be dramatic. Sophia deserves it. She's always been there for this family." Something inside me snapped at those words. "And I haven't?" I asked, my voice sharp, almost shaking with the force of years of swallowed resentment. "Do you even know what it took for me to get that penthouse? Every late night, every deal, every risk, I did it alone. Alone. While you were busy pouring everything into Sophia, I had to claw my way through the world with nothing but my own two hands. And now you want me to hand it over like it's some extra handbag in my closet." My mother's eyes narrowed, the false warmth draining from her face. "We raised you better than this. Family first. That's what we taught you." I met her gaze head on. "No. You taught me Sophia first. Always Sophia. Her lessons, her car, her college, her wedding. Everything was about her. I was the afterthought, the one you pushed to the side, the one you expected to survive on scraps. And I did. But what I built is mine. Not hers. Not yours. Mine." Her grip on my arm tightened, her manicured nails digging into my skin now, no longer pretending to be gentle. "You will not embarrass us here. Not today. Do you understand?" Her words came through gritted teeth, low enough for only me and Dad to hear. I yanked my arm free. "If you want me to hand over my life's work, then yes, you will be embarrassed. Because I won't do it." For a heartbeat, her mask slipped. I saw the fury flash across her face, raw and unfiltered, before she quickly pulled the gracious smile back into place. "Come back to the table," she said sweetly, venom dripping from her tone. "We'll talk later. Don't push me, Madison." Not here. I returned to the ballroom, my chest tight, my skin still burning where her fingers had pressed into me. The music played on, laughter swelled, and yet I felt like I was walking into a battlefield disguised as a celebration. Sophia caught my eye from across the room. She was radiant, glowing, her husband leaning in to whisper something in her ear that made her laugh. She looked so blissfully unaware. But deep down I wondered, was she truly oblivious? Or was she perfectly aware of the war her parents were waging in her name? Dinner was served. Crystal plates of roasted lamb, salmon, and fine wine were placed in front of us. The room buzzed with conversation, the clinking of glasses, the hum of music. But at our table the air was thick, heavy with something unsaid. My father leaned closer, his voice low, a command hidden under the pretense of reason. We're asking you one last time. Hand over the keys. Do it gracefully or what? I interrupted, my voice louder than I intended. Heads turned at nearby tables. Forks paused midair. My father's jaw clenched so hard I thought he might explode right there. Don't test us, my mother whispered sharply, her eyes flashing, her hand snapping to rest on my father's arm as if to calm him. But it wasn't for him. It was a signal for me. A warning. But I was done being warned. Done being treated like the shadow daughter, the invisible one. For years I had bent my head, bitten my tongue, pretended their neglect didn't matter. But not tonight. Not in front of hundreds of witnesses. And then it happened. My mother rose gracefully, glass in hand, her voice ringing clear as she tapped it with her spoon. A toast, she announced, smiling like a queen addressing her court. The music dimmed, the crowd hushed, all eyes on her. My stomach twisted. I knew what this was. This wasn't a toast. This was a trap. To my beautiful daughter Sophia, she said warmly, her smile wide and practiced. And to the joy of family. Because family, dear friends, only works when everyone remembers what it means. When everyone gives, not just takes. And then like a dagger, her eyes slid toward me. Isn't that right, Madison? A ripple of whispers ran through the room. My throat tightened, but I forced my expression into something calm, unreadable. I would not let her corner me, not like this. Yes, I said, my voice steady, cutting through the hush. Family is about giving. But it's also about respecting boundaries. Gasps, murmurs, a few nervous laughs. My mother's smile faltered just for a moment, the mask cracking. We gave you everything, she said, her voice still sweet, but shaking slightly now that the room was listening. You gave Sophia everything, I said clearly, not caring who heard. What I have I built. Alone. Her eyes darkened. She took a step closer, forgetting the microphone in her hand was still live. Her voice dropped to a hiss, but it carried through the speakers for the entire ballroom to hear. Ungrateful. You disgrace us. And then before I could even move, her hand flew. The slap landed across my face, sharp and loud, echoing through the room. Gasps erupted. The music stopped. Cameras froze mid-flash. My cheek burned, my earring flew off, and for one suspended second, the entire wedding stood still. That I didn't flinch. I didn't raise a hand to my face. Slowly, deliberately, I bent down, picked up my earring, clipped it back on, and straightened. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, but my voice was steady, low, and filled with something I hadn't felt in years. Power. No, I said. Just one word, but it carried through the silence like a blade cutting clean through silk. The room exhaled in shock. My mother's hand trembled, her face pale with fury, her mask completely shattered. 200 guests stared, whispers spreading like wildfire. My father's face was red, his jaw tight, his fists clenched under the table. Sophia froze on the stage, her smile gone, her husband shifting uncomfortably beside her. And in that moment, I knew this was no longer about the penthouse. This was about years of silence, years of being treated as less. This was about revenge. Because if they thought this slap was the end of the fight, they were wrong. It was only the beginning. Her voice boomed through the ballroom speakers, shaking the chandeliers above us. Madison Hayes, she said like she was announcing a criminal on trial, you will not humiliate this family today. Hand over those keys and show some respect. She stood only a few feet away now, her eyes burning holes into me. 1,000 silent prayers, maybe even curses, floated through that room as 200 pairs of eyes bore into my skin. This was no longer a wedding toast. It was a public execution. My mother didn't want peace. She wanted obedience. I felt my pulse slow, unnaturally steady, the way it always did when negotiations turned hostile in boardrooms across Singapore and Hong Kong. The same instinct that had saved multimillion-dollar contracts was saving me now. But this wasn't a corporate rival. This was my mother. And she had the crowd on her side. Respect, I repeated, my voice low but carrying, because I'd learned how to pitch words so they traveled without needing amplification. Is respect demanding your daughter surrender her home in front of strangers? Is respect cornering family with ambushes? The crowd shifted uneasily. Whispers surged, people pulling out their phones as if hoping to capture history in shaky vertical videos. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirrored wall. Tall, unflinching in my navy silk dress, a diamond earring missing, a red mark blooming across my cheek where my mother's hand had landed. For a moment I almost looked like someone else, a warrior standing her ground in enemy territory. Sophia's mascara-coated tears sparkled under the lights as she whimpered into her microphone. "Madison, please. I just thought you'd be happy for me." Her voice cracked perfectly, almost rehearsed, and the audience melted like wax under her candle flame. My cousins rushed to dab at her cheeks. Guests patted her back. A photographer caught the image, Sophia the fragile bride, abandoned by her cruel sister. The optics were catastrophic. That's when the ballroom doors opened. A hush swept through the crowd like a tidal wave pulling back from shore. Every head turned. The man walking in was immaculately dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his stride calm but commanding, as if the floor itself adjusted to his pace. Marcus Chun, CEO of Chun Global Investments, silent partner in Hayes Capital, my boss, my mentor, and the man my father had no idea owned nearly half his empire. My mother's face drained of color, as if all the blood in her body had fled at once. Dad's champagne glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor. The sound was deafening, but nobody flinched. All eyes were on Marcus. He didn't look at them. He looked at me. And then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his gaze on my parents. "Quite the spectacle," he said, his voice smooth as polished steel. "I caught the live stream on my way here. Not exactly the kind of family values one expects from the Hayeses." A ripple of gasps traveled across the ballroom. People began whispering his name. The weight of who he was fell like a thunderclap. This wasn't just a guest. This was Marcus Chun, a man whose signature could bankrupt companies overnight. He owned banks, properties, shipping routes. And now, standing in this ballroom, he owned the narrative. Dad tried to recover, fumbling with the microphone. "Marcus, Mr. Chun, we weren't expecting—" "No," Marcus interrupted, his voice calm but lethal. "You weren't. Which is why I'm glad I came. Because what I've just witnessed is not only disgraceful, it's potentially criminal. Coercion, public duress, attempted asset transfer without consent." He ticked the charges off like bullets on a gun. Each word landed harder than the last. The crowd buzzed louder now. Phones were raised higher. And my mother, for the first time in her life, had no words. "Marcus," I said carefully, stepping forward, because I could see where this was headed. "Thank you, but I can handle this." He studied me, a flicker of pride softening his gaze for just a second. "I know you can. But sometimes, Madison, it's important that people see who stands behind you." The message was clear. He wasn't here to save me. He was here to reveal the truth. Dad finally found his voice, though it cracked like old glass. "This is a private family matter. We don't need outsiders interfering." Marcus's lips curved into a half-smile that made seasoned executives tremble. "Outsiders? Richard, I own 40% of your company. That makes me far more than family." The ballroom gasped again. My father froze, his carefully curated facade crumbling in real time. He hadn't known. He hadn't suspected. And now the truth was unraveling in front of 200 witnesses. Sophia's tears dried instantly. She blinked at Marcus, suddenly aware that the golden stage she'd been given was collapsing under her. "Wait, 40%? "Yes," Marcus replied casually. "And Madison Hayes is my vice president. She oversees our Asia-Pacific expansion. The penthouse you've been fighting over? It's not just her home. It's a protected corporate asset under Clause 15.3 of our property agreement, which means any attempt to force her into transferring it." He paused, letting the silence drag out like a blade before delivering the final cut, is null and void, and legally actionable. Silence. Pure, suffocating silence that I let my eyes wander across the room. All those faces that had laughed at me, doubted me, dismissed me. Uncle Tom, who thought a modest apartment was all I could manage. Aunt Sally, who laughed when I said the word penthouse. My cousins who whispered that I was picky, difficult, unlovable. Every single one of them now saw me not as the invisible daughter, but as a woman who held power they couldn't even comprehend. My mother's hand trembled around the microphone. Her voice, once a booming weapon, was a whisper now. Madison, why didn't you tell us? I tilted my head slightly, just enough to let her know I was still her daughter but no longer her victim. Because you never asked. The crowd erupted. Not in applause, not in condemnation, but in that low-fevered buzz of gossip that would spread through the city by morning. They'd all witnessed it. They'd all seen my parents try to strip me of my independence, only to be stopped by the very man who kept our family's empire afloat. But I wasn't finished. I stepped forward, took the microphone gently from my mother's frozen hand, and turned to the crowd. I want to make something clear. Family is important, but family is not ownership. Family is not coercion. And family does not demand sacrifice at the cost of dignity. My voice grew stronger with each word. I built my life from nothing but hard work. I've been dismissed, overlooked, underestimated, even here in this very room. But tonight I draw a line. The penthouse is mine. My independence is mine. And no one, not even my own parents, will take that from me. The words hung in the air like lightning waiting to strike. Some guests clapped softly, hesitant at first. Then others joined. Not everyone, of course. Half the room sat stiff and scandalized. But enough joined in that the sound grew, a rumble of approval. Sophia dropped her act, fury flashing across her face as she hissed, "You've ruined my wedding." "No, Sophia," I said quietly, handing back the microphone. "I've saved my life." She gasped, but before she could retaliate, Marcus stepped forward once more, his hand lightly brushing my shoulder in solidarity. "Congratulations, Sophia," he said smoothly, turning to the bride and groom. "Enjoy your marriage. But let this be a reminder. Some gifts cannot be demanded. They must be earned." The ballroom doors closed behind him as he left, his presence like a storm that had passed through, leaving wreckage in its wake. And as I stood there, in the center of the room, with the whispers of 200 people swirling around me, I realized something. For the first time in 32 years, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't the backup daughter, the difficult child, the shadow of Sophia's perfection. I was Madison Hayes, and the city would remember my name. But what none of them knew, not Sophia, not my parents, not even Marcus, was that this was only the beginning, because family wars don't end with weddings. They only escalate. And by morning, every headline in the business community would prove it. The ballroom should have returned to celebration after Marcus left, but instead it vibrated with an uneasy electricity, like the air before a thunderstorm. 200 guests sat stiff in their chairs, whispering into their champagne glasses, trading theories about what had just happened. The music had died completely. The band members were staring at me as if they'd accidentally walked into the wrong show. This wasn't a wedding anymore. It was a battlefield, and I was the last one standing. My sister glared at me from across the room, her perfect bridal smile crumbling into something sharper, uglier. "You humiliated me," she hissed, low enough that only I could hear as she brushed past me on her way to the ladies' room. The delicate lace of her gown whispered against the marble floor like knives being unsheathed. Humiliated her? I almost laughed. This was her idea of humiliation. Her sister refusing to be sacrificed on the altar of Sophia's perfection. To her, my no was worse than a scandal, worse than betrayal. But I stayed silent because silence was my deadliest weapon. The guests were restless now. My relatives fanned themselves with folded programs, trying to pretend they weren't gossiping about me while their eyes darted in my direction. Aunt Sally, who had laughed earlier about my cozy little apartment, kept shaking her head like she couldn't reconcile the image of me as a successful executive with the story she'd told herself for years. Uncle Tom sipped whiskey at the bar, his face pinched, as if he had lost money personally by discovering the truth. And my parents. My father sat slumped in his chair, staring at the broken stem of his champagne glass like it was a roadmap out of this disaster. My mother's hand still trembled, clutching the microphone she'd forgotten to put down. They weren't furious anymore. They were terrified. Because Marcus hadn't just revealed his stake in Hayes Capital, he'd revealed their dependence. The empire they bragged about at every holiday dinner was not entirely theirs. It had strings, and those strings led directly to me. "Ladies and gentlemen," the wedding planner finally stammered, stepping onto the stage, her voice quivering. Let's take a 15-minute intermission before dinner is served." Chairs screeched against marble as people stood, grateful for an excuse to disperse. Clusters of guests retreated to corners, buzzing like bees. Phones were out, thumbs flying over screens. By midnight, every gossip blog in the city would know that Madison Hayes had refused to hand over a penthouse and that Marcus Chan had dropped a bombshell about owning half my father's company. And that was exactly what I wanted. I slipped away from the ballroom before anyone could corner me, heels clicking against the polished hallway floor. I needed air, space, and a moment to gather the storm inside me before it consumed everything. I pushed open the doors to the terrace overlooking the city. Night had fallen, and the skyline glittered like a field of diamonds scattered carelessly across black velvet. The same skyline my penthouse towered over. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had spent the entire day mocking me for something they thought I was exaggerating. And now my independence was the only thing anyone in that room could talk about. The terrace door creaked open behind me. I turned slowly, expecting Sophia with more venom, or maybe Dad ready to beg me privately. But it was neither. It was Brian. The groom. He loosened his tie. His face flushed from embarrassment rather than alcohol. "Madison," he said carefully, like he was approaching a dangerous animal. That was rough in there." I raised an eyebrow. "Rough is one word for it. I didn't know they were going to do that," he added quickly, holding up his hands in defense. "The penthouse thing. Sophia told me your parents had cleared it with you. She said you were generous." I almost laughed. Generous. That was her code word for disposable. But Brian looked sincere, his jaw tight with frustration. Maybe he wasn't as complicit as I'd assumed. "She lied," I said flatly. "And you went along with it because it suited you." His shoulders sagged. I wanted to believe her. It's her day, Madison. I wanted her happy. "And what about me?" I asked, folding my arms. "Does my happiness not count?" Brian hesitated, then sighed. "You're right. It was wrong. All of it. And if it means anything, I'm sorry." I studied him. This was the first time anyone in that family circle had apologized to me. It was almost disarming. But apologies didn't erase the truth. He had stood there smiling while they announced my penthouse as if it were confetti. He had benefited from my humiliation. "Sorry doesn't rebuild trust," I said finally. "But it's a start." He nodded, then lowered his voice. "For what it's worth, your sister is furious. Not just about the penthouse. About Marcus. About everything. She thinks you've been hiding all this to spite her." I let out a short laugh, bitter as espresso. "Of course she does. Sophia thinks the world revolves around her. So naturally, my career and my life choices must be part of her personal drama." Brian winced. "She's intense. Try living with it for 32 years. I muttered. He chuckled despite himself, but then his expression sobered. "She's plotting something. I don't know what. But she won't let this go. Just be ready." And with that he slipped back inside. Leaving me alone with the city lights, I stayed on the terrace for another 10 minutes, letting the cool air calm the fire in my chest. But I wasn't stupid. Sophia wasn't going to forgive and forget. My parents weren't going to crawl into bed and sleep this off. They had been publicly stripped of their control, and people like them didn't retreat quietly. When I finally returned to the ballroom, dinner was being served. Guests picked at lobster tails and filet mignon while sneaking glances at me over crystal glasses. I took my seat at the far end of the head table, deliberately distant from Sophia and Brian. My plate remained untouched. My appetite had been devoured by adrenaline hours ago. Halfway through dinner, Sophia stood abruptly, glass in hand. Her smile had returned, sharp and brittle like glass ready to shatter. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice sugary but loud enough to silence the room. "Before dessert, I'd like to share something personal." Something about my sister. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I knew that tone. It was the same one she used as a child when she tattled to our parents about me sneaking extra cookies. She gestured toward me with her champagne flute. You've all just witnessed how protective Madison is of her property. But what you don't know is why. She paused, relishing the attention, the tension, the spotlight. Because Madison's penthouse isn't just a home. It's a shrine. To herself. A ripple of laughter ran through the guests. I felt the sting, but I kept my expression neutral. Sophia pressed on, her voice rising with each word. She decorates with framed magazine covers, her magazine covers. She keeps awards displayed like trophies in a museum. She even named one of her wine cellars after herself. Madison Hayes everywhere you look. No husband. No children. Just Madison, Madison, Madison. The room tittered with cruel amusement that I stood slowly, pushing my chair back with deliberate calm. And why shouldn't I? I asked, my voice slicing through the laughter. Why shouldn't I celebrate what I've built, when nobody else in this family ever has? You want to mock me for living alone? Fine. At least I'm not begging for handouts disguised as wedding gifts. Gasps ricocheted around the room. Sophia's face twisted, the mask finally tearing away to reveal raw fury. You think you're better than me? No, I said evenly. I know I am. The silence that followed was thunderous. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, the ballroom doors burst open again. A man in a dark suit rushed in, clutching a phone. His face was pale as parchment. He beelined straight for my father, whispering something in his ear. My father's expression collapsed. He gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. What is it? My mother demanded, panic sharp in her voice. My father looked at her, then at me, and finally back at the man who had delivered the news. His voice broke as he said, the board has called an emergency meeting. Tonight. Marcus has demanded it. And they're voting on my position. The room exploded in whispers, gasps, confusion. I stood frozen, the weight of it sinking into my bones. This wasn't just a wedding scandal anymore. This was war. And the battleground had shifted to the empire itself. The room dissolved into chaos the moment my father announced the board meeting. Guests who had come expecting cake and dancing were now craning their necks like spectators at a public execution. My sister's face drained of color, her bridal glow replaced by raw fear. My mother clutched her pearls so tightly I thought the string might snap. Marcus hadn't just thrown a stone into the pond. He had detonated a bomb under the foundation of our family. I leaned against my chair, deliberately calm, watching my parents unravel. My father barked at the man who delivered the news. That's impossible. They can't vote without me present. It's my company. The man's eyes were full of pity. With all due respect, sir, it's not just your company anymore. Marcus Chun holds enough shares to call an emergency session. The rest of the board has already assembled. They expect you in 40 minutes. 40 minutes. The wedding had officially ended. No matter how many flowers still draped the chandeliers or how many violinists kept sawing nervously at their strings. This wasn't Sophia's night anymore. It was mine. Sophia grabbed my arm, nails biting into my skin. You knew about this, didn't you? You and Marcus planned this. I met her gaze without flinching. Not everything revolves around you, Sophia. Sometimes, consequences are just consequences. She yanked her hand back like I'd burned her, but her eyes glittered with venom. She wasn't going to forget this, not for the rest of her life. My parents stood, their chairs screeching backward. My mother's voice was shrill enough to silence even the whispers. We're leaving. Now. We'll deal with this disaster, and when we come back, Madison, you will answer for this humiliation. I rose too, smoothing the fabric of my gown. I don't owe you answers. Not anymore. Their glares cut into me, but I didn't move. I let them storm out, dragging Sophia in their wake like a child throwing a tantrum in designer lace. Brian hesitated, torn between following his bride and staring at me, but eventually duty won. He shuffled after them, shoulders hunched. The ballroom emptied in their absence, guests slipping away with muttered excuses. Nobody wanted to be around when the empire cracked open. Within minutes, the grand hall looked like a battlefield after the war. Half-eaten plates, overturned glasses, abandoned jackets, and me. Alone. I didn't go after them. I didn't beg. For the first time in my life, I didn't need to. Because Marcus was right. Power wasn't begged for. It was claimed. The boardroom smelled of old wood, cigar smoke, and fear. By the time I arrived, flanked by Marcus, the long table was filled with the most powerful men and women in the company, people who had smiled at my father's jokes for decades, who had nodded obediently at his orders. Now they shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, avoiding his eyes as he stood at the head of the table, red-faced and trembling. "You can't do this," he thundered, slamming his fist against the mahogany. "I built this company from the ground up. Without me, none of you would even be here." Marcus sat calmly at the other end, his fingers steepled, his voice even. "And yet here we are. The bylaws are clear. With the percentage I hold, I have the right to call for a vote of confidence. Tonight, the board will decide if you remain as CEO." Gasps rippled around the room. My father looked at me, then really looked at me as though seeing me for the first time. His eyes narrowed. "This is your doing. You and him. Conspiring against your own family." I stepped forward, heels clicking against the polished floor. "No, father. This is your doing. You treated me like a pawn, like a resource to be plundered whenever Sophia wanted something. You slapped me in front of strangers. You mocked my independence. And now? Now you're paying the price." The silence was deafening. Even Marcus seemed to pause, studying me with something like admiration. One by one, the board members raised their hands when the vote was called. Some hesitated, but most didn't. Loyalty to a sinking ship wasn't loyalty at all. It was suicide. When the final count was tallied, the verdict was clear. My father was out. Effective immediately, he collapsed into his chair, the fight draining out of him. My mother let out a strangled sob, clutching his arm as though she could hold his power in place with sheer desperation. Sophia, still in her wedding gown, stood frozen, eyes wide with disbelief. That I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply stepped into the silence and claimed what was mine. "If you're looking for leadership," I said, my voice steady, "look no further. I may not have asked for this, but I am ready. And unlike my parents, I won't waste this company's future on ego." The room shifted. I saw it in their eyes, the acknowledgement, the calculation, the acceptance. I had stepped out of their shadow, and I wasn't going back. Hours later, when the dust had settled and the board had dispersed, I found myself alone in the now empty conference room. The city lights stretched beyond the window, glittering like the universe itself had laid a crown at my feet. Marcus entered quietly, closing the door behind him. "You did well," he said simply. That I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Did I?" He tilted his head. "You didn't flinch. You didn't crumble. You took control. That's more than your parents ever taught you." For the first time that night, I allowed myself a small smile. Maybe humiliation was exactly what I needed. A reminder that I don't have to play their game anymore. I can make my own rules. Marcus's eyes glimmered with approval. "Just remember, Madison, power attracts enemies." Tonight was only the beginning. He was right. I could already feel it. Sophia's glare had promised war. My mother's sobs had promised vengeance. My father's silence had promised that he wasn't done yet. But I wasn't afraid. For the first time in my life, I was free, and I intended to use that freedom to burn their empire to the ground, brick by brick, secret by secret. The wedding had been their celebration. The boardroom had been my coronation. The war was just beginning. The morning after felt like the city itself had shifted on its axis. Headlines screamed. Morning shows replayed the slap in slow motion until my face felt like a permanent fixture on every commuter's screen. My phone was an orchestra of notifications, messages of support, job offers, media inquiries, sympathetic notes from women I'd never met who wrote about leaving toxic families, and sprinkled among them venomous messages from relatives and strangers who thought a daughter should always obey her parents. The chorus was loud, messy, and relentless. I read a handful, then silenced my phone. The noise would not shape me today. I woke in my penthouse, a sanctuary that felt more like a fortress now, sunlight pooling across the hardwood floors, casting patterns that looked, for a second, like prisoners trying to break free. The penthouse had never felt like a trophy. It was a ledger of work. Late nights where the city outside my window crawled with lights like tiny affirmations, boardroom victories that paid for each marble slab, and deals negotiated in cramped hotel rooms that later became company strategy. That day, every inch of it felt like proof. Marcus texted, "Meeting at 9. Bring nothing. Trust me that I dressed for a fight anyway. Tailored blazer, blouse that didn't scream but spoke efficiency, pants that commanded space. Power dressing was not performative for me, it was language." When Marcus arrived, he did not come with theatrics. He stepped into my kitchen, placed his briefcase on my counter, and exhaled as if the last 2 days had required oxygen reserves he'd hoped he wouldn't need. "You did well," he said. "But you know the board will react. They will slice at the soft underbelly of anything that threatens their comfort. Expect whispers, calls requesting private meetings, and a few who'll feign concern while questioning your temperament." He slid a folder toward me. "I've pulled the documents. Clause 15.3 has teeth. And I've instructed legal to prepare for any attempt at retaliation. They're already drafting notices to clients about potential instability, damage control, frankly. Some will leave, some will stay. The important bit is that we control the narrative. You don't have to be the angry woman on the defensive." He paused. "We get to define this. Control the narrative." That line echoed in my head. Up until now, my family had written chapters in my life. They believed narration belonged to them. They'd never considered that the narrator might fight back. Within an hour, Hayes Capital's legal team had spun into motion. Marcus moved with the terrifying efficiency of a man who had spent his life anticipating panic and turning it into structure. Legal notices were sent to my parents immediately, formal, precise. They outlined the protections granted by Clause 15.3 and the company's position on coercion and moral turpitude. There was no room for ambiguity. Marcus made it clear. Any attempt to seize assets, manipulate transfer documents, or coerce me into voluntary transactions would result in immediate legal injunctions and an emergency board action. Still, legal armor can be a blunt instrument against familial rage. Laws could stop contracts from being signed under duress, but they could not stop whispers at country clubs, the slow ice of social ostracization, or a mother who felt entitled to public vengeance. My mother's next move, I knew, would not be rational. Entitlement rarely bows to logic. That afternoon, social media was a creature with a life of its own. The slap was remixed into memes, op-eds, think pieces about family dynamics in the age of social media, and worse, opinion columns that tried to parse my choices as if my choices could be reduced to a lecture about filial piety. There was a hunger in people for scandal, and scandal is a commodity that sells. But in the constant churn of the internet, the narrative began to change the moment a reputable financial outlet published a profile explaining the structure of Hayes Capital and detailing Marcus's stake. The piece was factual, careful, and devastatingly effective. It lifted the mask on the family's little empire and reframed the story. Not a daughter refusing charity, but a businesswoman protecting corporate assets. That evening, my parents chose damage control of a different kind, performativity. They posted a carefully worded statement, apologies by proxy, vague, with phrases about deep remorse and family matters are private. It read as if a PR firm had composed it with one hand while the other hit a trembling fountain pen. My mother's profile, however, was a separate beast. She went on a tirade, long, impassioned, full of the self-pity that politicians use to regain favor. Somewhere in the swirl of comments, an old friend of hers typed, "Her heart is broken." People rallied behind the idea of a heartbroken woman, which was infuriating because it framed my mother as the injured party. It was a bait many swallowed with relish. Marcus was not interested in bait. He was interested in leverage. By the next morning, he had convened a press conference. The room smelled of cold air and cheaper coffee when we walked in. Cameras blinked, reporters shuffled, and the comfortable buzz of a city's gossip engine rose in a wave. Marcus stepped up to the lectern first. He was composed, his presence a study in practiced calm. He spoke of corporate responsibility, executive protections, and personal safety. He framed the events as a violation, not merely of family boundaries, but of legal and moral lines that protect executives and private citizens alike. He read a statement that mapped the protections enshrined for employees and executives against coercion and public pressure to transfer assets. He did not mince words. Any attempt to weaponize family against corporate holdings would be met with decisive legal consequences, Then he turned the microphone to me. I did not rehearse my words. I did not want the tremor of scripting to undermine what I felt. I looked out at the sea of cameras and faces and spoke plainly. Tonight was not about property, I said. This is about dignity. It's about being seen and respected. I have spent my life building, negotiating, and earning. I do not owe my achievements as unpaid labor to satisfy someone else's illusions of entitlement. If anyone believes they can demand what I fought for simply because they share DNA, they are mistaken. There were flashes. Reporters scribbled. Marcus stood at the edge of the stage like a sentinel. The narrative shifted. The woman in the penthouse was no longer only a figure in a soap opera clip. She was a voice, and that mattered. The aftermath of the press conference was messy but strategically favorable. Hayes Capital clients were polled privately. Several expressed concern at what they'd witnessed, yes, but many also expressed relief at seeing a decisive response. A few of Dad's clients indeed withdrew, some citing concerns about stability, while others were more blunt. We will not do business with people who behave like that. Contracts worth millions went into review, some terminated. My father's ledger, once a testament to his perceived invincibility, looked suddenly vulnerable. Marcus had done the math before he made his speech. The board's response was calculated. Shake the tree, see who falls out. Some did. Some clung on to home. There was fallout of a different texture. My parents, stripped in public and humiliated by their own choices, retreated into a defensive theater. My mother wrote a series of letters, long, rambling, full of accusations that attempted to reframe me as the villain who had delighted in destroying her daughter's wedding. She called me late at night, voice thin and pleading, accusing me of orchestrating a coup. My responses were sparse, concise. I'd found clarity in the middle of a storm. To engage her was to lend oxygen to a fire that could take months to die. So I kept responses measured and rare. Sophia escalated. The marriage, which had been beginning with the naive idea that privilege could buy love, began to show fissures. The honeymoon to Bali was postponed. The guests who'd returned gifts did so with nervous notes. The glitter that had hung over her day tarnished under the scrutiny. She sent me letters, some venomous, some pleading, each one more telling than the last. She accused me of stealing her joy. I read them and felt a strange detachment. These were words thrown by someone who had always known she could call upon others to solve her problems. Now she was encountering a boundary she'd never been taught to respect, and in private, other players made moves. There were whispers of attempted back-channel negotiations, offers to buy me out, promises of family harmony in exchange for assets. One cousin visited, eyes watering, bearing a casserole and advice, the latter heavily laced with the family line. You must forgive. It's about blood. He didn't have the language for why that line discomforted me so much. Blood doesn't equal moral entitlement. That I began a small campaign of my own. It was not violent or dramatic. I did not seek revenge with the petty cruelty my parents had hoped I would. Instead, I acted strategically the way I had been trained in business. I restructured my public image, worked with PR to highlight systemic issues of coercion and power, reached out to nonprofit groups protecting women in abusive family situations, and made sure my legal counsel was in constant motion. I also did something that calmed me. I donated a significant sum of my promotion bonus to a women's shelter. Not as a flourish, but because the causes that protect people like me should have resources. When word of the donation leaked, there was a quiet swell of respect. People could reduce me to a meme or a clip, but they couldn't argue with action. The donation was not a performance. It was a statement that life could be rebuilt and that the rebuilding could include lifting others up. My parents' social currency dwindled. The private clubs that had once welcomed them now offered stiff sympathy, their members shifting alliances like migratory birds. Invitations stopped coming. The garden parties where they used to trade gossip cooled into awkward silences when their names were mentioned. It was an unpleasant joy watching people who once nodded enthusiastically at my father's baritone begin to hedge, whisper, cross streets to avoid his path. People respond to power. When power moves, loyalties shift. But even with money and strategy at my back, there were nights I sat in the dark and felt the ache of severance. The legal victories and public vindication did not heal the hollow space where family had once been. There were small human moments that the business headlines never captured. The memory of the woman who had taught me to tie my hair, The father who once had tossed me into the air and laughed. The scent of the kitchen where we baked cookies when I was small. Those memories were not interchangeable with validation. They were grief, complicated and sharp. One evening, weeks after the wedding, my mother showed up, unannounced, at the concierge booth of my building. The doorman, James, who had known me for years and whose daughter I'd once helped get into a summer program, looked at her with polite caution. "Madison isn't taking any visitors," he told her quietly. "She's moving on." My mother's face hardened. "I just want to see her. I want to explain." She had a small paper bag in her hand. I imagined it held apology cookies or a letter. The gesture was symbolic, the words inside calculated. James, with the integrity of someone who had been on both sides of broken family tables, refused entry. He called me and described his interaction. I didn't go down. I finished a report. I did not want the theater. I did not want to be part of the performance track she so loved to stage. Eventually, my mother tried public mea culpas, speaking on morning shows with a practiced contrition that smelled of PR. When asked if she'd regret her actions, she cried, real tears I suspect, but tears that had more to do with the changing contours of her world than with the harm she'd caused. The segment was balanced. Some viewers were moved, others felt she had evaded real accountability. The revenge I'd promised earlier was not a series of stunts. It wasn't the dramatic unmasking of private secrets for spectacle. It was slow and precise, it was legal containment, it was social realignment, it was building something that could not be demanded or stolen. It was watching a life I had constructed continue to flourish despite the best efforts of those who once called me their OWAA company. Town hall. A month later, I walked onto a stage to address employees who had been watching our family saga from their screens, with concern and with curiosity. I spoke about leadership and respect, about the ethical responsibilities of those who manage resources, about personal boundaries. I did not mention the wedding. I did not need to. The message landed. People applauded. It felt, finally, like the work and the advocacy were converging. I had converted humiliation into leverage and leverage into policy. But the war had not ended. My father launched a few last-ditch attempts to reassert himself, calls to former friends, letters to the board begging for clemency, private pleas to clients to reconsider. He could not very well re-enter the office and recite the old lines about stewardship without acknowledgement that his actions had eroded confidence. The board, meanwhile, reconstituted itself under Marcus's guidance and began a slow process of repair. They were pragmatic. The company had to survive, and survival required distance from the spectacle that had almost ruined it. Sophia filed for divorce months later. The papers arrived in a simple clinical envelope that felt cleaner than any social media post she'd ever written. The marriage had been an attempt to merge two comfortable lives. Neither could swallow the reality triggered by public shame and humiliation. Her calls to me became less frequent than sporadic and eventually stopped. When she did call, the conversations were small, clipped, as if two strangers were trying to navigate the ruins of a bridge neither wanted to cross. I did not gloat. I did not dance on the graves of their relationships. I had learned that victory felt quieter than I'd imagined. It was the small things. Uninterrupted sleep, an email from a young woman thanking me for the donation that helped her escape abuse, a promotion nod from the board for exceptional leadership under duress. These things landed like soft landings on the long nights that it would have been easy to become bitter, to allow the narrative to calcify into anger. Instead, I chose to invest my energy in building structures that protected others. I took meetings with legal advocacy groups, I funded public workshops on workplace coercion, and I met privately with women who had histories similar to mine. Each conversation reminded me why I'd refused to give in that night under the chandeliers. It wasn't just for me. It was for anyone who had ever been told their work belonged to others. My mother tried one more tactic: apology via intermediaries, a small basket of fruit sent to my office, then ultimately silent withdrawal. She refused to admit wrongdoing publicly, even as she privately begged relatives to help restore her social capital. The people who had once flattered her now used the wedding as a cautionary tale. One by one, invitations stopped coming. My parents' house, once a hub of warmth and pretense, became quieter, haunted by the echo of what had been lost. The city, always hungry for the next scandal, eventually moved on to another obsession. New stories made headlines. But the ripples we'd started at that wedding continued. Laws were discussed in private meetings. Corporate boards reviewed clauses protecting executives from personal coercion. Women called our legal partners asking for advice. The small structural shifts were not dramatic, but they were durable. At night, when the penthouse lights dimmed and the city went quiet, I sometimes allowed myself a glance back, not toward the family I'd left behind, but toward the path I'd chosen. It was not without loss. I had fewer birthdays with my childhood family, fewer holiday dinners that might have been awkward and sweet in equal measure. But I had peace. I had the knowledge that I'd not capitulated. I had a life that bore the imprint of my choices. One late autumn evening, months after the wedding, my assistant sent me a short text. "Your mom was at the old bakery today. She looked small." I stared at the message and felt a rush of something like pity. I thought of the woman who'd taught me to braid my hair, the woman who could not see the damage she caused. For a moment I considered calling. Then I remembered the way she had slapped me under the chandeliers, the way she had elevated another daughter to a throne built partly on my shoulders. I breathed out, folded my hands, and decided that pity was a luxury I could not afford to squander. My life needed forward movement, not reconciliatory theatrics. Revenge, I had learned, can take many forms. Mine was not loud and public. It was enduring, steady, and principled. It was the rebuild. It was the donations, the legal reforms, the mentoring, the quiet assertion that a person's work and dignity are not public property to be claimed by relatives. It was living so well, ethically, with intention, that the spectacle of me failing no longer entertained anyone. The war had rattled the foundations of a family, toppled a patriarch, and changed the course of a company. But its most lasting strike was quieter. It helped define a new normal where families could not weaponize their children's success with impunity. Toward the end of the year, as holidays approached and the city cooled, I opened a small card in my mailbox. It was a simple note, undecorated, no flourish. It read, "I am sorry for what I did. I am getting help." See, not an apology for the slap, not an admission of guilt for the public humiliation, just a plain acknowledgement that something had been broken. I folded the card back and placed it on my kitchen counter. It was not closure, but it was a start. Perhaps the best any of us could hope for. I poured a cup of coffee, looked out over the skyline, and felt, in the hollow spaces where grief had lived, a slow warming glow. The penthouse was still mine. The city still sparkled. The fight had cost me many things, but it had given me something impossible to take away: the ability to choose myself. The city never slept, but that night it felt like the entire skyline was holding its breath, waiting for me to make my move. My father's empire was still smoldering from the boardroom coup, my mother's cries still echoing in my ears, and Sophia's glare still etched into my mind like a brand. They had spent decades building walls around me, convincing me I was weak, controllable, disposable. But in tearing me down, they had taught me exactly where their foundations cracked. And now I was going to bring the whole house down. The first strike had been corporate, clean, clinical, numbers, votes, signatures. But revenge isn't just about paperwork. Revenge is about scars. And I intended for mine to be permanent. I started with the silence. Days passed where I didn't answer their calls, didn't respond to the endless stream of texts demanding explanations, begging for forgiveness, or spitting venom. My absence became a presence, gnawing at them louder than words ever could. I knew my mother's obsession with appearances. Silence would eat her alive. I knew my father's hunger for control. My distance would feel like chains. And Sophia? Sophia lived for my attention, whether in rivalry or resentment. Cutting her off was the cruelest blade I could wield. But silence was only the beginning. Marcus and I spent nights poring over files, contracts, and accounts. He slid folder after folder across the table, exposing the rot that had festered beneath my father's empire for years. Bribes hidden under shell companies, offshore accounts stacked with hush money, nepotism deals where Sophia's whims had cost shareholders millions. Every page was another nail in their coffin, another weapon in my arsenal. "Release it all at once?" Marcus asked one night, his tone calm, his eyes sharp. I shook my head. "No. Drip by drip. Let them drown slowly." And so it began. One morning, a minor scandal about inflated invoices hit the press. My father brushed it off, calling it fake news. A week later, Leaked documents tied Sophia to a disastrous investment in a luxury spa project that had collapsed before construction even began. She went from blushing bride to laughingstock overnight. Then came the offshore accounts. The bribes. The photos of my father at exclusive retreats with men whose reputations were poisoned. It wasn't an explosion. It was a slow implosion, their carefully curated image caving in from within while the world watched. And through it all, I remained silent. No statements. No interviews. Just the occasional calculated appearance at a gala or charity event. Smiling, radiant, untouchable. Every camera loved me, and every headline whispered what everyone already suspected. Madison had risen while her family fell. My mother cracked first. She showed up at my penthouse one evening, makeup streaked, hair disheveled, desperation dripping from her every gesture. She pounded on the door until my doorman let her through. "Madison," she sobbed, collapsing at my feet. "You have to stop this. You're destroying us. You're destroying your sister. Please, whatever we did, whatever I did, I'm sorry." For a moment I almost faltered. Almost. But then I remembered the sting of her slap, the humiliation in that ballroom, the years of being her afterthought. I crouched down, tilting her chin until her tear-streaked face met mine. "You taught me something important, Mother," I whispered. "That appearances matter more than love. That power matters more than kindness. So forgive me if I don't believe your apology. It comes too late, and it doesn't matter anymore." I stood, leaving her on the marble floor of my penthouse lobby. She called after me, her voice breaking, but I didn't look back. My father lasted longer, but when the tax authorities raided his office, even he couldn't hide the panic in his eyes. The once untouchable king reduced to a cornered criminal. He tried to rally, tried to spin it as a political attack, but the board he'd ruled with iron fists turned their backs one by one. Power is a fickle lover. It abandons you the moment you're no longer useful. And then there was Sophia. I expected fury from her. I expected screaming, threats, dramatic confrontations. What I didn't expect was her silence. Weeks passed and she said nothing. No calls, no texts, no late-night tantrums. She vanished from the society pages, from social media, from everywhere. At first I thought she was hiding, too ashamed to face the fallout. But then Marcus came to me with a file that chilled my blood. "She's plotting something," he said simply, sliding the papers across the table. "Plane tickets, bank transfers, meetings with shadowy figures we couldn't quite trace. She's not broken. She's regrouping." The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time, I had an opponent who wasn't my father, who wasn't my mother. For the first time, Sophia was stepping out of their shadows just as I had. But unlike me, she wasn't fighting for freedom. She was fighting for vengeance. The thought should have scared me. Instead, it lit a fire in my veins, because revenge wasn't just my game anymore. It was the family legacy. And if Sophia wanted war, then war she would have. The night before the biggest shareholder gala of the year, Marcus found me staring out at the city from my balcony, the skyline glittering like shattered glass. "You know she'll come for you tomorrow," he said. I didn't turn. "Good. Let her. I've been waiting for this." He was silent for a moment, then stepped closer. "Revenge has a way of consuming people, Madison. Don't lose yourself in it." I finally looked at him, my voice steady. "I'm not losing myself. I'm finally finding myself. They wanted me small, obedient, silent. But I'm not any of those things. I never was. And tomorrow the world will see that too." The gala was a battlefield disguised as a celebration. Glittering gowns, crystal chandeliers, champagne flowing like rivers, and under it all tension so thick it could choke. Cameras flashed as I walked in, every lens capturing the image of the woman who had risen from humiliation to power. I smiled, dazzling and untouchable, even as my pulse thundered in my ears. Halfway through the night, as speeches droned on and glasses clinked, the lights flickered. For a moment the room plunged into darkness. Gasps echoed, and when the lights returned, she was there. Sophia. Gone was the blushing bride. In her place stood a woman hardened by betrayal, dressed in black, eyes blazing with fury. She didn't wait for permission. She strode to the stage, grabbed the microphone, and her voice sliced through the ballroom like a blade. "You think Madison is your savior?" she spat, pointing at me. "You think she's the future of this company, of this family? She's nothing but a viper. She destroyed our parents, ruined our family, and now she'll ruin all of you too. The room erupted in whispers, cameras flashing like gunfire. I didn't flinch. Slowly, deliberately, I rose from my chair and walked toward the stage. Every step echoed, silencing the crowd. When I reached her, I took the microphone from her trembling hand. "You're right, Sophia," I said, my voice calm but carrying. "I did destroy our parents. I did burn down the empire they built. But not because I'm a viper. Because I refused to be prey any longer. They underestimated me just as you do now. That was their mistake. Don't make it yours." Her eyes blazed with hatred, and I knew then that this wasn't over. Not tonight, not tomorrow, maybe not ever. But that was fine. Because revenge wasn't a moment. It was a lifetime. That I raised my glass to the crowd, my smile sharp as a blade. "To the future," I declared. "My future." The applause was thunderous, but all I heard was Sophia's ragged breathing beside me. The war had only just begun. And this time I wasn't just playing to win, that I was playing to rule. But tell me, when blood turns against blood and sisters become enemies, who really wins? If you want to know how far Sophia will go to destroy me, and how far I'll go to stay on top, don't miss what happens next.